The year was 1998. Sony was at the top of the gaming world with the continued success of the PlayStation, when a modest software company known as Connects approached them about licensing their brand for a brand new piece of Mac software they were making. The product? Software that would allow you to run PS1 games on any Macintosh computer. An emulator, if you will. Despite a successful demonstration of running Crash Bandicoot and Ridge Racer using the application, Sony not only refused to approve of the project, but also filed a cease and desist notice at the company. A lengthy legal battle ensued. While the project, now named the Kinetics Virtual Game Station, did manage to successfully hit store shelves in 1999, complete with a Windows port, the legal fees heavily damaged Kinetics, eventually causing them to end up selling the software to Sony on March 15, 2001. But despite this legal battle, and the battle against a similar emulator known as Bleem during the same period, the courts ended up ruling in favor of the two emulation teams, proclaiming that unofficial emulators like them and countless others are indeed covered under the fair use doctrine. Hello? As stated in the last video, one of the most difficult aspects of gaming is keeping older games playable. Previously, I discussed Nintendo's efforts, so naturally it made sense to continue the story by discussing Sony's work on the subject. The PlayStation 2 initially launched back in 2000, before the Kinetics purchase, so the solution for backwards compatibility instead involved them literally putting a MIPS R3000A, the same CPU the PS1 used, into the system. Unsurprisingly, compatibility is incredibly good as a result, with around 12 or so titles suffering from problems on early models. The CPU is also utilized in standard PS2 games as well, functioning as an I/O processor. However, the slimline models released in 2004 would inexplicably replace it with a more generic PowerPC processor, decreasing the system's compatibility with PS1 and a couple of PS2 games. Regardless, this would mark the beginning of Sony's backwards compatibility efforts, with Sony's next two consoles being the peak. On March 14, 2006, during the PlayStation business briefing, Sony announced that the PlayStation Portable would gain what they referred to as e-distribution features, or the ability to download and play games off the memory stick. Instead of revealing any potential digital-only games or anything like that, they instead dropped the surprise reveal that you could download PlayStation 1 titles onto the system. However, most people will probably remember the actual demonstration of this during the infamous Sony E3 2006 conference 2 months later, where Kaz Hirai, then CEO of Sony at the time, pulled out a PSP and played Ridge Racer on it, becoming one of the many highly quotable lines to come out of that event. The finalized version of said e-distribution service, now unsurprisingly renamed to the PlayStation Store, would then launch with the PS3 itself and only on the PS3 on November 2006. Yes, really. For 10 whole months, the only way to download digital PSP games, including the newly introduced PS1 classics, required you to download them onto your PS3, then transfer them over to the PSP, despite the PSP having proper Wi-Fi support. Sony's first solution to this rather blatant problem was to introduce a PC application called MediaGo, which could access the PlayStation Store for transferring games just like the PS3 could. Not that much of an improvement. And so with the release of PSP's version 5.0 update on October 2008, they finally decided to just allow PSP users to access the store using the system, with no need for any extra consoles or software. Despite that bizarre initial setback, the emulation is actually very high quality. The PSP uses a MIPS R4000 CPU, which is a direct successor to the R3000 the PS1 used. So it's likely that, combined with the kinetics code that Sony bought, was a major factor in how they managed to create a very high quality emulator on this small handheld, with reports from the early days of hackers modding the system claiming that over 90% of the PS1's NTSC library could run on it. However, the official lineup is much smaller, with around 265 PS1 games re-released in North America. Like the Virtual Console, imports were also available, with the vast majority of them being released by a seemingly defunct company devoted to re-releasing Japan-only titles known as Monkey Paw Games. As for the PS3, this is where things start to get confusing. When the system initially launched in 2006, it was backwards compatible with both PS1 and PS2 games. PS2 games were handled by placing the Emulation Engine CPU and the graphics synthesizer GPU into the system, much like how the PS2 handled its backwards compatibility with PS1 games, while the PS1 games were fully emulated for the first time. There was some initial reports about compatibility issues during the launch period, though these were later fixed over the course of several firmware updates. However, there was just one problem. The system infamously launched at a price of
$659 Canadian,
and sales were pretty badly affected by that high price. So Sony ended up scrambling to remove components to help lower costs to a more reasonable level. A front panel hiding several flash memory ports, 2 USB ports, and even Super Audio CD support were taken out. But the most damaging removal was the loss of the PS2 components. They initially took out the Emulation Engine CPU, instead having all of its functionality be emulated, with the next revision removing the graphics synthesizer GPU, and in turn disabling backwards compatibility entirely, despite initial reports claiming that the hardware was merely in the system as a stopgap until they finalized a fully software emulator. Meanwhile, the PS1 games thankfully stayed compatible through the entirety of the PS3's lifecycle, including both of the Slim models. The PS1 classics, initially PSP exclusive, would also become playable on the system with the release of the version 1.70 update on April 19, 2007. But there is more to this story than it seems. Sony actually did eventually make a full software emulator for the PS2. They just never used it for backwards compatibility purposes. On October 3rd, 2011, Sony revealed a promotion called Only on PSN, where they would release a series of digital-only titles on the PlayStation Store. But at the bottom of the post, there was a mention of something else. A selection of rare classic games were going to be released on the store the next day. God Hand, Grim Grimoire, Maximo Ghost to Glory, Odin Spear, and Ring of Red. Yes, a selection of obscure PS2 exclusives were quietly added to the PlayStation Store, and unsurprisingly, they were all being emulated. This marked the beginning of the PlayStation 2 classics. Like the PS1 classics, they're fully emulated titles available digitally, but unlike the PS1 classics, they were the only way for most PS3 models to run PS2 games. Despite the initial push of including rare titles, it wouldn't be long until more well-known games, most notably the Grand Theft Auto series, started to hit the PlayStation Store. In total, about 102 games would be re-released using the emulator. Fortunately, a much smaller lineup compared to the PS1 classics, though it still had a decent lineup regardless. But this somehow wasn't the end of Sony's PS3 emulators, as even the PlayStation Portable itself had an emulator. Version 3.15 of the PlayStation 3 system software, released on December 8, 2009, introduced support for downloadable minis titles, a series of small 100 megabytes or less games initially designed to be played on a PSP. More specifically, the smaller file sizes were designed to make them easier to store on the then newly introduced PSP Go, which infamously removed the UMD slot in exchange for 32 gigabytes of digital storage. Rather than going through the trouble of porting every individual game onto the PS3, Sony just straight up coded an entire PSP emulator to run them, with the vast majority of minis being playable on both PS3 and PSP, complete with the ability to transfer save data between the two platforms. But over in Japan, something far more interesting was unfolding. On May 23, 2011, Sony announced the PlayStation Portable Remaster series, a series of PSP games running in HD using the same emulator, with higher res textures, the same ability to transfer saves between both the PSP and PS3 versions, as well as full-blown stereoscopic 3D support. However, the implementation is a tad unusual. Unlike most retail PS3 games, you actually have to install the entire game onto the hard drive and select it like you normally would with a digital game, though you do need the disc inserted to run it. After that, you then realize the game does not run in full screen resolution. It still looks good, mind you, but not having it full screen is a bit strange. The disc also includes an application known as Ad Hoc Party, normally used for playing local-only PSP games online using a PS3, which was also compatible with these remasters, and a couple of trailers for the very game you're playing. Unfortunately, only 6 games were released in this format: Monster Hunter Portable 3rd, Keion Hokugo Live, Dynasty Warriors Strike Force 2, and the Trails in the Sky trilogy. And again, none of these were released outside of Japan, though the fact that none of these games were localized in the first place probably had something to do with that. That same year, Sony introduced their next handheld, featuring dual analog pads, a touchscreen, and 3G connectivity. That's right, it's the Xperia Play? Yep, Sony released a phone tailored for gaming, and it actually had some PS1 games released on it. Every system included a free copy of Crash Bandicoot, with a small set of other games released on the Google Play Store as well, including Cool Borders 2, Jumping Flash, Kula World, Siphon Filter, and Wipeout. Curiously, the ESRB also rated a set of PSP games for release on the device: Daxter, Siphon Filter, Dark Mirror, Pinball Heroes, and Flow, though they were never officially released, so it's unknown if these were meant to be actual ports or running on an emulator. This, however, would prove to be the end of Sony's incredibly high quality efforts towards backwards compatibility, with the PlayStation 4 completely dropping the ball on this front. To understand how, let's go through the previous consoles in order. The PlayStation 1 would prove to be the easiest to emulate, considering the tech for it already existed, but they instead decided to include zero support for it, not even the PS1 classics. The closest thing to an official statement on the matter happened during the re-release of Vib Ribbon on PS3 back in 2014, where they explained work on a way to make it available on PlayStation 4 was happening. Of course, that was over 5 years ago, so it's clear whatever those plans were never went anywhere. Sony has been supporting the occasional remaster of a PlayStation 1 game on the platform, such as Crash Bandicoot and Medieval, but it would be ideal to have access to the original game as well. The PlayStation 2 has some actual emulation support on the PlayStation 4, but it's far more limited compared to last gen. On August 16, 2015, Sony announced a Star Wars PlayStation 4 bundle containing the Battlefront reboot and 4 classic Star Wars titles: Super Star Wars Racer Revenge, Star Wars Jedi Starfighter, and Star Wars Bounty Hunter. The first one is an SNES game, ported to the PlayStation 4 by the team at Code Mystics, but the last 3 proved to be far more interesting. When the bundle finally launched on November 17th, it was discovered that the games were not standalone ports, but in fact the original PS2 versions of said games running on an updated emulator. The biggest addition would be trophy support, which Sony had previously acquired a patent for the feature back in September 2012, alongside running the games at a higher resolution. The next month, Sony would properly roll out the new PlayStation 2 classics on the PlayStation Store, with The Mark of Kree, Dark Cloud, Rogue Galaxy, Twisted Metal Black, War of the Monsters, and the Grand Theft Auto trilogy as part of the launch lineup. However, there is one major flaw with this new setup, which is the fact that Sony barely adds new games to it. So far, only 54 games have been released using this method, and they've gradually slowed said releases down. 2018 only saw 2 new games added, both of which were poorly thought out re-releases of one of the many SNK game compilations that had already been released elsewhere. While 2019 so far has only seen a re-release of Ace Combat 5 that you could only get by pre-ordering Ace Combat 7, this would have been fine if the system had some form of support of PlayStation 2 discs like the PS3 initially did, but this is not the case. The Psp Emulator has a similar issue, though Sony never advertised them as being emulated. Re-releases of Parappa the Rapper, Patapon, and Loco Roco were revealed in 2016, which, when they released the next year, were discovered to be emulated in a similar fashion to the previous PSP Remaster series, complete with new enhancements such as actually running in full screen and the aforementioned trophy support. But once again, they've barely released any titles in this format, with the only title released after the initial trio was Loco Roco's own sequel. Patapon 2 was also announced as coming in 2018, but as of this video, it appears to have vanished off the face of the earth. But the worst console to have been affected by the lack of proper backwards compatibility is its direct precursor, the PS3. The PlayStation 3 is particularly notable for using an incredibly complicated PowerPC processor known as Cell. The complexity of making titles on it was a pretty big issue during the early days of the system, so when work started on the PlayStation 4, Sony greatly simplified things by using a much less complex 64-bit AMD Jaguar CPU. Unfortunately, even though the previous systems, at least initially, included the previous console's hardware instead of using emulation, Sony refused to do it this time, explaining that while they could freely manufacture the Cell chip, the supporting hardware included has parts that would become difficult to obtain. But despite this setback, they still ended up making a replacement of sorts, albeit a very problematic one. In 2008, the exact same year Sony started the earliest pre-production work on the PlayStation 4, a little company known as Gaikai was formed. Their goal? Allow people to stream games directly off the cloud. Just a few months later, they showed off the tech in action.
Okay, what I wanted to do is to give you a real demonstration of Gaikai running. This is on my home computer using Firefox. There's no plugins, no installs, nothing. So I didn't have to go to the store. I didn't have to install anything. I could be playing a game this quickly. And as you can see, the performance is actually really good. And this is for us, this is the longest distance I'd ever put a server. So I'm pretty happy with the performance.
By the time the service actually launched in 2011, it ended up being used as a makeshift demo service, with the ability to play games such as Mass Effect 2 and Dead Rising 2 for a short period of time. They did have plans to provide full games eventually, and even inked deals with Samsung and GameVice to provide the service on their devices. But in the end, Sony bought the company outright on July 2nd, 2012, killing off Gaikai's plans as a standalone service. So, what did they end up doing with the company after this? Well, they used their tech to upgrade remote play on the PlayStation 4, introduced a fairly nice feature known as share play that allows you to simulate playing a game locally with friends online, and most importantly, created their own game streaming service. 2 years after the Gaikai acquisition, Sony revealed PlayStation Now, a brand new service that lets you stream a selection of PS3 games on multiple platforms, such as the PlayStation 4, Sony branded televisions, Sony branded phones, Sony branded Blu-ray players, Sony branded PCs, and, in a bizarrely confusing twist, the PS3 itself. However, support has been heavily downgraded to just PS4 and PC nowadays. They would later add PS4 and PS2 games later on. In fact, they even let you download them onto your PlayStation 4 to play offline. But the PS3 games is where the issue lies. To reiterate, this is mostly a cloud gaming service. You don't download the PS3 games to your console, you can't play them offline because of this, and if Sony decides to shut down the service someday, that's it. It's over. You can never play PS3 games on your PlayStation 4 ever again. And that is the problem with PlayStation Now. Cloud gaming services are perfectly acceptable as an alternative to playing games locally, but when you start making stuff exclusive to the platform, that is a massive issue. Compare it with some of the other cloud gaming services out there, such as OnLive. Every single game on that service was also available and easily accessible on PC. So when they ended up shutting down in 2015, it wasn't a major loss. People did lose access to their games, but you can still play them in some form by buying them again elsewhere. To make matters worse, it's clear that the problem is only going to get even worse in the future. Locking your only form of backwards compatibility to the cloud is one thing, but we're reaching the point where large companies are specifically planning to make games that are only available on a cloud gaming service. There are some advantages to making exclusives on the cloud, namely the fact you're no longer limited in terms of console power, but ensuring that you can still play the game in the long run is and always will be far more important. Going back to Sony, their current view on backwards compatibility can unfortunately be summed up by this incident. In 2017, Time published a lengthy interview with Sean Layden, the chairman of Sony Interactive Entertainment Worldwide Studios, and Jim Ryan, previously the global sales chief at the time, and is now currently the CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment outright, in which the two discuss the future of PlayStation. Eventually, the interviewer brought up the subject of backwards compatibility, where Jim promptly destroyed all future hopes of it ever returning. When we dabbled with backwards compatibility, I can say that it was one of those features that is much requested, but not actually used much, was where it started, ignoring the fact that you don't add backwards compatibility with the expectation that people use it. You add it for historical purposes, to ensure that your games will last forever, and because it shows that you care about your audience. Then he decided to take some time to mock said older games outright. I was at a Gran Turismo event recently where they had PS1, PS2, PS3, and PS4 games. And the PS1 and PS2 games, they looked ancient. Like, why would anybody play this? Yes, this is a real quote. He just straight up questioned people wanting to play older games in the first place. Keep in mind these ancient PS2 games were being resold to you on PlayStation 4 by this point, with only a resolution bump differentiating them from how they were all those years ago. And the countless re-releases of games that are older than even the PlayStation 1 available on PlayStation 4. So this really demonstrates how little Sony cares about the subject nowadays. Of course, a little thing called the Nes Classic Edition had been launched by Nintendo a few months prior to this interview, and promptly made a ton of money. So naturally, Sony wanted in on that pile, regardless of the fact that Nintendo was clearly using the project as a cheaper alternative to their more in-depth emulation efforts such as the Virtual Console. So, on September 2018, Sony had brought their own mini console to the table, the PlayStation Classic, which was launched in December that year to profoundly metacore reviews. Quite a bit went wrong here. First off, the system wasn't using the internal emulator Sony had been using for the past several years. They had instead licensed out the unofficial PS1 emulator PCSX Rearm. Considering that thanks to the Xperia Play, they already had said internal emulator running on the same ARM architecture that the PlayStation Classic was using, this is a particularly confusing decision. Second, they ended up using the slower PAL 50Hz versions of several games, which appears to have been done in a poor attempt to disguise the final issue. Lastly, the whole thing was cheaply made. Games suffer from frame rate issues, there's no visual settings to change, and they inexplicably decided to include the very basic launch PS1 controllers, rather than the rumble and analog stick enhanced DualShock ones. All of this led to a console that didn't work out, which is especially unfortunate considering this is all Sony has left when it comes to re-releasing PS1 games. Currently, this story ends with the upcoming PlayStation 5, which is confirmed to finally bring back backwards compatibility, albeit limited to just the PlayStation 4 as of now. Sony has filed a new patent for BC, specifically for simulating processors included in older consoles, but no consoles are directly mentioned in the patent text, which leads me to believe it's specifically for the aforementioned PS4 BC and nothing else. It's certainly not an announcement worth celebrating, but it does show that work is just barely being done on the subject. And that's everything. Every single attempt Sony has made at emulating. Well, there is one final console out there. One that, while it failed to make an impression on most consumers, pulled off an incredible last stand at keeping their older titles alive. This is the PlayStation Vita. When it was initially announced under the NGP name, they went right out of the way to state that PSP and PS1 games would be compatible, though the former is fairly unique. Unlike the previous backwards compatibility attempts, where you can just insert the disc and run it that way, the Vita has no support for the PSP's proprietary UMD format in any form. So, how did they fix this? Well, in what would prove to be a trend for the system during its lifespan, the intended solution was only available in Japan. Sony had planned a Western service for converting UMDs into a digital copy as far back as the PSP Go, but it was cancelled due to what they claimed were legal and technical reasons. But when the Vita launched in Japan, a service known as UMD Passport was available. You would download the application on your PSP, have it scan your UMD copy of the game, and then be able to purchase the game again digitally at a discount. It wasn't compatible with every game, and the discounted prices could vary wildly depending on the title, but it's still better than the complete lack of solution outside Japan. Aside from that setback, PSP compatibility is pretty much perfect. It does use a whitelist system, but not only is the vast majority of digitally available PSP games playable on the system without issue, hacking and the occasional glitch has shown that every PSP game could theoretically run on the system just fine, even ones that were never released digitally. PS1 games were similarly effective, While they weren't available at launch like the PSP games, it only took the 1.80 update, released 6 months after the Western launch, to get them working. It technically uses the same whitelist system that PSP games require, but again, only a very small subset of titles aren't compatible with the Vita. However, this somehow wasn't enough for Sony in Japan. Whoever was handling the PS1 classics over there just refused to stop releasing them, even when they practically gave up on the Vita elsewhere. While the flow of PS1 classics were quietly stopped back in 2015 for the US and Europe, the same year Sony officially ended first-party game development on the system, the Japanese store just kept going and going and going. The last game released on it was on January 22nd, 2019, as in 4 whole months ago. They also released far more PS1 games there in general than any other region, with a grand total of over 753 games, which is actually more games than the entire Japanese Wii Virtual Console lineup. And that was a service with multiple consoles. To top all of this off, they even created an application designed to emulate an obscure peripheral. The Pocket Station, originally released back in 1999 in Japan only, was pretty much the PlayStation 1's equivalent to the Sega Dreamcast's visual memory unit, though it was announced about 5 months after the latter, so it's unlikely to have been made in response to it. But regardless of its similarities with other hardware, an application was released on the Vita that emulates it, allowing you to use its functionality on any PS1 classic that supported the accessory, topping off what sadly became Sony's last attempt at actively preserving their history. On March 1st, 2019, the Japanese site for the Vita was quietly updated to indicate that they had stopped manufacturing the system, concluded by a report made much earlier that Sony was shutting down production on retail games for the console that same month. The only official statement from them, published in an interview with Famitsu back in September, where Senior Vice President Hiroyuki Oda stated that they had no plans to make a successor, and affirming that the system would be discontinued the next year. No big press release or anything like that. Just a quiet ending for what was Sony's last handheld console. And so, the Vita was finally gone. While she failed to make an impression on consumers outside of Japan, her efforts in keeping both the PS1 and PSP's libraries alive is something that should never, ever be forgotten.